Hello, everyone. It's exciting to have over 250 of you joining this webinar on network transformation. I'm Kelly Campbell. I'm a partner at the Bridgespan Group, and I'm the head of our Children, Youth, and Families practice, and I will be moderating today's panel. There's growing excitement about the role that nonprofit networks can play in making significant social change in today's world, and we are really excited that over the next hour, we'll have the chance to hear from several of the most innovative network leaders the stories of their transformational efforts to solve some of society's most pressing problems. They'll share with you what they've done, what it takes, and challenges along the road to making a real difference. Our panelists today include network leaders and funders who were featured in the article Network Transformation: Can Big Nonprofits Achieve Big Results? We have Neil Nickel, the President Emeritus at the YUSA, Steve Weir, the Vice President of Global Program Development at Habitat for Humanity International, Commissioner Carol Seiler, Territorial President for the Women's Ministries at the Salvation Army's Central Territory, and Ron Ottinger, the Executive Director at the Noyce Foundation. Our plan for the hour that we have together is that we'll start with a brief overview of the research that Bridgespan conducted on network transformation. Next, you'll hear a short story from each of our panelists about the work that they've been doing. Then I will pose a question to each panelist so that we can learn a little bit more about the nuances of the work that they've been doing. And we'll leave about 15 minutes at the end for questions from our audience. Now I'd like to hand it over to my colleague Shazeen Virani, who will tell us more about the research that inspired this webinar. Shazeen?
Thanks, Kelly. Hello, and thank you all for joining us today. I am very excited to share a little bit of context with you all before we shift to hearing from our esteemed panelists. To start, let me share our working definition of a network. When we speak about networks, we are talking about organizations with affiliates spread across the country or the globe. We started our work with the fundamental notion that networks really have incredible assets that other organizations seeking to achieve impact just may not have. They've got enormous reach and scale, touching thousands of communities across the U.S. and the world. They have significant dollars. The biggest networks in the world are often multi-billion-dollar organizations. They're among the largest nonprofits in the country, and many of them have strong brands. I think we would all be hard-pressed not to know of organizations like the Y or the Salvation Army or Habitat for Humanity. However, even with all of these amazing assets, networks are often viewed through this historic light and are known for what they've always done. As such, they're often overlooked as the innovative problem solvers that they are. As part of our work, we interviewed leaders of over a dozen national networks, including those pictured in this slide, Habitat for Humanity, Feeding America, the American Red Cross, and many others. We found that a variety of these innovative networks were trying to truly transform their impact in what we are calling a pivot. This pivot that we observed was a shift not just from serving needs, but also to serving needs and solving underlying problems that cause those needs. So while we are going to hear much more from each of our panelists, let me just share a few key themes that we found in these networks that were very serious about making this pivot from serving to serving and solving. One common theme we heard is that these pivots were often catalyzed by data. That is, network leaders asking hard questions about true impact on problems that they'd been trying to solve for generations, and using either internal or external data to help them to understand the answers to these questions. In many cases, we heard that this data really helped to crystallize how these networks were falling short of their aspirations. And many network leaders noted that armed with this data, they were able to create those aha moments or that rallying cry to motivate the whole network and stakeholders to try a new approach together. Another theme we heard is that these pivots were rooted in the long-standing history and traditions of these networks. Organizations really looked back to their past and try to reconnect with their historical mission or reason for being, identifying historical assets and strengths, and then determining how they could use or build on these assets to solve social problems that are relevant today. We also found that there just isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to how networks chose to implement this pivot and transform their impact. There were different pathways that networks have chosen. Of course, this makes complete sense given the diversity of the organizations and the problems they're addressing. And while we did see many differences in the pathways, we did see networks using two prominent approaches. We categorized one of these pathways as anchoring on measurable outcomes. To say focusing on a single or a small set of outcomes that the network was trying to strive to reach, and unleashing the network affiliates' innovative ideas and experimentation to achieve those outcomes. We'll see in 4-H's science initiative anchoring on a few key outcomes and giving local offices the freedom to design good programs or strategies to achieve them, or Habitat for Humanity really anchoring on the housing deficit. We'll hear more from Steve Weir in a few minutes about this. For many networks and nonprofits generally, this focus on anchoring on outcomes is a big departure from measuring output of the services they've always provided. We also categorized a second pathway. This pathway has been categorized as anchoring on evidence-based approaches. That is to say, identifying and scaling evidence-based programs or models throughout the network. We'll hear more from Neil Nickel about this approach with the influence of the Diabetes Prevention Program or the Power Scholars programs at the Y. Whether these programs were found from within the network or externally from other organizations, the approach implies a programmatic consistency and fidelity to these evidence-based programs. Finally, our research focused on and surfaced some of the challenges that networks were facing as they were embarking on these incredibly important pivots for their organization. In particular, we surfaced two really important challenges. One was funding, not a surprise here. Network leaders identified a real challenge in getting the upfront funding needed to invest in capacity that was required to make this pivot. Additional capacity both at the headquarters level, in the field, for data systems, for program development, and we'll hear a little bit from Ron about the funder perspective on this. Another challenge that was constantly cited was governance. Networks, as we all know, are an extremely complex organization, and the internal structures or plumbing could often be hard to work with when trying to implement a new approach. We saw many networks that had pushed ahead and made this work within the existing structures, and we also saw that others required a significant overhaul in their governance to create a platform for the impact that they were seeking. So with that short overview of the context of our work, I'm going to turn it back to Kelly, who will introduce our panelists whose stories informed this work and will now be able to bring these insights to life for us.
Great. Thank you, Shazeen. Now I would like to introduce Carol Seiler, the Territorial President for Women's Ministries at the Salvation Army Central Territory. Carol is going to tell us more about the Army's journey and how data inspired their pivot from serving to solving. Carol?
Oh, thanks so much, Kelly. It's a pleasure to be here. One of the interesting things that challenged us was someone putting our own statistics back in our lap and saying, congratulations, Salvation Army, for this year, and it was about 2010 when we started doing this. In this year, you served 17 million people across the country. What did you do to solve? And it was a congratulations, but do more challenge, actually coming from Tom Tierney. And we said, no, that can't be true. We must be solving more than we think we are. But we began to research it, and over in the Midwest area, we had over 300 frontline units we asked. We got a 63% return from them, and consistently it came back that only 90% could do anything more they couldn't do anything more than just serve. And what we found with that and the comments that came along was a consistency that said, I'm tired of just putting Band-Aids on issues. I wish I could do more, and then all the reasons why they couldn't do more. So we looked at an internal challenge and looking at those reasons and said, is there a way that we could double our impact, look at an outcome-based focus, not just the outputs, but change the way we're working with actually some of the same resources we have, the staff, the skill level, the pay level, the location level, the communities, and how do we do more than that and begin to think of it. So we developed, with consultant help from Bridgespan, actually the Pathway of Hope program to focus on intentional strengths-based casework with individuals who were ready and had family members under 18. So we had 2 generational impact, and who were ready to say, with your help, I will attempt to work on these goals and change these conditions. So our self-sufficiency approach took a look at 15 different categories. It took a look at ways that they could be measured along that, looked at the barriers of the individuals. We felt it was very important not to abandon the most challenging people, but to look at families with children under 18 who were ready to make a difference on that. The hope element for us, for the Salvation Army, became really important because we felt that from the mix of our practical and our faith-based approaches, that if we could instill hope or have hope that people's futures could be different, we were no better than just an ATM machine. We use that phrase sometime. We're just doing transactional, relational things with people, and we're not really being true to who we are. So this story of transformation said, you know, we don't want to be an organization that is just doing handouts anymore. We want to do a hand up. That's our history, our heritage, and we want to make sure that that happens. So that's really what landed it. There's a whole lot more work that comes out of that in terms of culture change, in terms of activity, but as you start moving forward on this, what we saw was that people had a longing to do more than what they were doing. I don't know that people realized how much effort that was going to take, but we are seeing now some wonderful results from that, and in fact the concept has spread to the other territories in the United States, Canada, Australia, Europe, and other parts of the world.
Terrific. Carol, thank you so much for sharing that story. Next on our panel we have Steve Weir, the Vice President for Global Program Development at Habitat for Humanity International. And Steve is going to bring in the global perspective and tell us a little bit more about how Habitat is shifting to systems level impact. Steve?
Great, thank you. I think many of you probably know Habitat for Humanity as a U.S. institution. In fact, our focus group suggests many people don't even know we work outside of the U.S. We do work in about 80 countries globally, and we've had strategic plans. I think we're in our 5th strategic plan now. Each of those strategic plans, we encouraged our network to participate and take up a similar framework. Most did, but not all did. That's the nature of networks. Probably our most successful strategic plan is our current plan that we started in 2013. And in that plan, we actually revisioned how we thought about what success looked like. When we did our SWOT analysis, our mission statement says that we believe in a world where everyone has a decent place to live, and what we found is even at a fairly substantial size, we were helping about 500,000 people a year. If you looked across those 80 countries, including the U.S., in all of those countries, there was no country that could have eliminated their housing deficit in less than 100 years. And that really challenged us as a network to think about how could we have a vision statement that eliminates poverty housing, but we work at a rate that will take over 100 years, sometimes several hundred years. So it really made us drop back and think, is our methodology, is our approach right? And as we begin to think about it in the strategic planning process, we changed from a functional strategic plan to one that's more programmatic, theory of change based. And in that theory of change, we kept and built on the platform that we had at the community level, but we added a sector change and a societal change which we had done, frankly, some demonstration projects, and we had done in different network members, but not as a global network strategy. And it's enabled us to move from, as I said earlier, I think, helping about 500,000 people to over 6 million people in just 2 years in the strategy. And I give you 2 examples that we used in-house. We call it House 2, the sector change. We've added a market development strategy, and we've added a advocacy strategy. Market development, probably our keynote program that we have is Microbuild. It's a $100 million impact investment fund. We give wholesale lending to microfinance organizations. They have a network, they have customers, and we help them leverage the funding that they have with our money toward housing. And in just 2 short years, we've distributed about 50 million of the 100, and in 20 countries, we've helped more than a quarter million individuals. So that's just one example of the kinds of things that we're doing in market development. Advocacy, we've started a Solid Ground campaign where we're trying to help people improve their land rights, especially women. And we are now in 20 countries with a common global advocacy effort. A good example is a leadership school that we had in Bolivia, had 21 women who we helped build capacity in terms of leadership to advocate for their land rights. And in less than a couple of years, they changed the law that said that it went from women not being on the title to requiring women to be on the title for the title to be valid, impacting over 1 million women. So those are dramatic changes from the one house at a time, which we still think is important, but now we're actually operating at a community, sector, and society level in a much different theory of change impacting more people.
Thank you, Steve. Next, we're going to hear from Neil Nickel, the President Emeritus of the YUSA. And Neil is going to bring the evidence-based approach pathway to light and share a little bit more about how the Y is serving as a platform for scaling these evidence-based programs. Neil?
Thank you, Kelly. Let me start by giving folks just a brief frame of reference for how we started. The YMCA is a long-standing 165-year-old organization, and we had a long history as an innovator in this country, having founded 53 colleges and universities and the Peace Corps based on our international service worker programs, launching the Boy Scouts campfire, inventing basketball and volleyball. But as all large movement-founded organizations, we had become very transactional. And we're more, as an organization, focused on what we did than so what difference we were making. And we came to realize that we had tremendous capacity as an organization serving 22 million people with 2,700 branches around the country and a very, very large staff, that if we wanted to be more innovative and really take on large social and health programs and problems, we were going to have to change the way we operated and go through some significant cultural shifts. And so the question was then how to make that pivot. And really, as we got into that, it became clear that a key to our success was going to be less YMCA-centric. I think all large network organizations have a tendency to believe all knowledge resides within the network. We, however, came to realize as we launched our efforts in diabetes prevention, in the achievement gap, and particularly summer learning, and the STEM work, that in fact, if we were program agnostic and looked for evidence-based programs with hard data that would allow us to measure, we could in fact make significant change. So a couple of quick examples. We believe deeply that with 75 million people being affected by diabetes, we had the capacity to change that paradigm. And by partnering with Indiana University, we and United Healthcare, we launched the Diabetes Prevention Program, which had been shown by Indiana University to, in fact, reduce prediabetes in 58% of participants. However, it was cost prohibitive when offered by the healthcare industry. The Y offered the same program with the same results, 58% reduction. However, we did it at 30% of the cost. So the next question became, how do we make that accessible? This again required partnering with United Healthcare and 35 other healthcare organizations across the country, which led to change processes that required changing CMS codes to allow direct billing, and just 2 weeks ago, Medicare making the YMCA's Diabetes Prevention Program the first ever Medicare-funded health intervention that will reimburse a nonprofit organization. The second one we launched was our achievement gap work, and again, summer learning. And again, the key here was that as we looked at what was happening with children and low-income children dropping back 3 months each summer in their learning, we had to find a way to address that issue. The key was, again, finding a partner in the Bell organization who had a proven intervention, a data gathering system, and we became the network that would allow them to expand with our partnership and with training our staff their summer reading programs and summer math programs. We're now approaching 4 months into it. We're getting 2.6 months reading and math gains in just a 6-week program each year. Our partnership with Bell has now allowed us to expand to a summer Y Readers program, and we now have over 441 branches and 775 locations in 4 years, with thousands of kids and planning to touch 50,000 kids by 2020. So again, partnership, program agnostic, data gathering, evidence-based programs have been key to what we've done.
Neil, thank you for sharing that. Finally, we're going to turn it over to our representative of the funder community, Ron Ottinger, the Executive Director of the Noyce Foundation. Now, the Noyce Foundation was one of the most important funders for 4-H's Science Initiative, which was a huge effort to bring new, innovative science programming with powerful educational outcomes to over 1 million young people across the 4-H network. Ron, can you talk a little bit about that story and what compelled you to want to be a part of that 4-H effort?
Thanks, Kelly. The Noyce Foundation was founded in the memory of Robert Noyce, the co-founder of Intel, and the family members and trustees of the Noyce Foundation felt that the highest yield, highest value we could make would be within existing structures where the majority of kids were located to engage particularly young girls and low-income kids in STEM to go beyond the 25 to 30% of kids who traditionally have been involved in the STEM fields. The large youth development organizations collectively among 4-H, the Ys, Boys and Girls Clubs, Girls Inc., etc., reach over 20 million youth. And our feeling was that to help those organizations pivot and develop their capacity to offer quality STEM programming in their affiliates and chapters would be one of our highest value investments. We started with 4-H because 4-H is the largest youth development organization that has a focus on science. Secondly, then YUSA with Neil, and the Y is the largest after-school provider, reaching over 10 million kids, both on school campuses and off. But with 4-H, they wanted to pivot beyond agriculture. They wanted to get into each of the science, technology, engineering, and applied math areas. We helped them develop curriculum, new curriculum with the power of wind and alternative energy technologies, a wonderful robotics curriculum, which is linked to the next generation science standards called Junk Drawer Robotics. We helped them develop a professional development, an E-Academy. We helped them develop the ability to help local fundraisers and fund developers and collect data across their system. So our initial effort was with 4-H so that 4-H could then help and work with their colleagues in the other youth development organizations to help them build their capacity as well. Our strategy as a funder might be a little unusual, but we felt it was important. We partnered with 4-H and with each of the large youth development organizations. We felt we should be a thought partner as an investor. We felt that we needed to play at a large level, so our grants were over $1 million with 4-H. It actually, over 7 years, was about $1 million a year in investment over multiple years. We required a match. 4-H ended up tripling our $7 million investment. We also required local matches so that local affiliates who got grants, sub-grants from us through the national organization would then have the ability to match that on a local level. And we required data collection using simple instruments that have been validated and benchmarks both for capacity building as well as the impacts on youth. So that has been our strategy nationally, and we feel that has been fairly effective. The other large networks that we're working in addition to the major youth development organizations, are with the Mott State After-School Networks. 29 of those states are building capacity now. The Every Hour Counts, 12 of their urban city-based efforts, we're a partner. And then finally, the STEM ecosystem effort, the newest one, launched at the White House last November with 27 local state ecosystems working on reshaping science but with using in and out of school strategies.
Ron, thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists for sharing those stories. It's given us, I think, a much better understanding of how some of this actually plays out on the ground. And what I'd like to do next is to pose a question to each one of our panelists and start to shift from the what you've been trying to do to the how, and how you've been implementing some of these big changes. After that, we'll create some time to take some questions from our audiences. So Carol, I'd like to start with you. Could you talk a little bit about how did you find a model that would work for your organizational context and drive impact and results?
I think it was a lot of talking and working and decision-making amongst people who were in this field. So what we brought together was a steering committee where we were seeing previous expertise happening with what we thought was the transformational part, the case work, the breaking cycles of poverty, brought those folks together. We took a look at other evidence-based approaches in terms of what does it take to deal with social service outcomes. This was the focus that we had, our assisting and social service approach. We also took a look at what did we already have in place that would be helpful. So we had models where we were used to kind of regional training and coaching cohorts, and we took that model that if we put the person with the expertise supervising a smaller group of staffing, even if they may not have had the training, the background, or be paid at the same level, but they were in place. They were already used to having some oversight and coaching from a headquarters in their region. And then we looked at an organization that with a centralized policy and procedure approach, we could do some of those things to give people tools that were consistent. We could train to those process things, the consistency, and then we could challenge them in the middle to look at the collaboration potential in their own community, to look at the specific needs of the individual family. So the model was a bit of a hybrid of saying, okay, we're going to do some consistent envelopes, front and back end, data collection, approaches, formats, and then we're going to show you how to use with your coach your community variances and your individual family variances in the middle, and we're going to come out with this model that will work for you. I think the third part of the model actually that worked for us was we kept telling the story of transformation, of successes, of families whose lives were impacted, the trajectory for their future was impacted, and cycles of poverty broken, which is an astounding story. It's so difficult for many families. And we used our ethos of caring. That's who we are. And so that transformational heartstring tug, we kept telling the stories over and over and over and over, and we kept seeing more stories, and that would energize people. So we did this from a mix of ways: the practical, the emotive piece, the missional piece, and then really just from a centralized approach, decentralizing it out and supervising that way.
That's terrific. Thanks so much, Carol. So Steve, I'd like to turn to you now, and building on the story that you shared, this story of moving from a very direct service model, literally building houses one by one, to a sector-changing strategy where you're really, really working hard to eliminate the housing deficit. Can you just talk a little bit about where did you start on this, and what were the most critical steps to start down that very different path?
That's such a great question. Before we started the strategic plan, we spent almost a year revisiting our core documents. Every so many years, the board would add another key document, and we had kind of a plethora of core documents. And we decided to narrow those down and understand what is the really core important things. And we ended up with a single vision and a separate mission statement there was complete alignment around the world. We heavily engagement around the world, all 80 countries. Took a year to go through that. We'd send out drafts. So at the end of the year, I think we built trust. People believed that we were aligned in where we were going. It was not really a shift in the overall vision of what we'd had for 25 years. And then as we got into the strategic planning process itself, we developed this idea of moving from a direct delivery to essentially a partner delivery. So in a sector model, it's really third parties, partners, who are actually delivering the housing impact itself. And because we had gone through those core documents, people could see that the mission and vision hadn't changed. It was the delivery strategy that had changed. It's still a big change because it's hard for people to think about the how we do things is not the mission. How we do things is a methodology. So we became agnostic on the methodology, but highly evangelistic, if you will, to the vision and mission, which was consistent with how we started. We found people in the field who had innovation, some early prototypes of those, both advocacy and market development. We built a theory of change that showed how it still added up to the same vision and mission. And then the last piece that was really important is that we took different approaches to advocacy and market development. So in advocacy, that work requires relationships, and so the national organizations themselves, they had to build on their existing relationships in their communities, and we supported them in understanding a process of how they could advocate more effectively. Market development, it was such a completely different business model. We didn't really have the skill sets inside our national organization. So we actually, through our headquarters and regional offices, we created this separate impact fund. And then we asked the countries themselves to work alongside at the country level to help us support training and support of those financial loans as they were given by partners. And then slowly over time now, those countries themselves are beginning to look at their own market development approaches. So both delivering directly through existing relationships and market development, really stepping outside of asking the national organization to be the sole deliverer of those housing interventions. So we use two different strategies.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. Neil, I'd like to turn to you next. And the question I'd like to hear your thoughts on is, how did you get your network on board and do the change management required to make these changes? And we've had a couple of very related questions from our audience already along these same lines. What has it meant to work as a real network versus business as usual, and what's worked well and what's been hard.
Right. Thank you, Kelly. And let me start by saying I'll hit the topic headers of the change process we use, but as anyone who's been through a change process knows, this is a conversation in and of itself for multiple hours. And first and foremost, there's recognition that cultural change is really the sum total of hundreds of small decisions. It's not like you turn one switch and everything goes in a new direction. We found helpful to us as background a book the Heath brothers wrote 5, 6, 7 years ago, Switch, talking about the rider and the elephant, or emotion and logic. And so we began first with reinstituting pride in the organization, that we were in fact not 2,700 separate organizations, we were one organization. We looked at the major things, and that's why I mentioned it earlier, that we had accomplished as a national major organization in this country and around the world. And that began it's really to help us, help our leadership understand that we less were going to change people and more unleash the pent-up desire they had to make a difference in people's lives. In fact, that's why people came to work for us, and we had become so systems-oriented that we had really baked out that desire. And so part of it was turning people loose. Part of it was gathering a coalition of the willing, getting the right people who were passionate to take leadership around our cause. There was a lot of talking about pride in our history. And as we were doing that at the same time, and no small element of this, we had to become, as the national organization, if we were going to lead change, highly credible in terms of the quality of what we delivered, the talent we had on the organization, attract talent, compensate them appropriately, so that in fact when we yelled charge, people had confidence that we could accomplish what we were setting out to accomplish. We moved then, and of course all of this happened somewhat sequentially, but also in tandem with each other, to beginning to recognize across our organization a different way of how we were going to look at numbers. We were no longer going to count how many people as our primary, that we were serving as our primary point of reference, but very much more what was the impact we were having. How were we going to measure that we were in fact changing lives? This then was also in partnership with an awful lot of time simply getting in front of people and working with them and creating a sense of partnership and ownership of all of this. We would hold annually 15 meetings around the country in a 20 to 25 day period with all YMCA's represented at one of them, simply to have these kinds of conversations, all communications built on this. There was the funding aspect that had to be changed. And so we actually self-funded much of our change process by engaging with our member associations, creating a vision for them, and asking them to self-raise their dues for short periods of time, 2, 3 years, produce results, and then do it again, until finally we got to the place where 3 years ago we had an 84% approval of a complete dues restructure change that allowed the funding for much of what this is happening now. And then it also required constitutional changes. So it was a very intentional process, first emotional, then logical and structural, and again, hundreds and hundreds of small decisions, being sure that everything was aligned.
Thank you so much, Neil. And finally, Ron, could you share with us any advice that you would give to other funders that are thinking about funding these sorts of network transformation efforts?
Great, Kelly. That's a great question. We thought about sustainability with leaders up front, with 4-H, with the Ys, now with Boys and Girls Clubs and Girls Inc. We didn't want to help launch something that after our funding ran out would significantly recede and not have the national scale that we and the leadership of each of the major organizations. So thinking about sustainability from the beginning we thought was critical. Secondly, what level does a funder want to play? We felt that if we really wanted to be at the table and a thought partner, that we had to invest over $1 million a year in each of these major pivot efforts, and then helping each of the organizations develop their national fundraising capacity and requiring matches so that the locals and affiliates use the opportunity to locally from even new sources, not just the existing sources. And finally, the critical data has run through this whole discussion. Having the organizations develop benchmarks so we knew annually how much capacity of what kind was being built, what capacity was being built among the local staff and volunteers to offer quality STEM experiences, and then the check and balance. What was the impact on kids in terms of their increased interest, engagement, the development of their skills? So those would be some of the major keys that I would point to.
Great. Thank you so much, Ron. So now we're going to turn to our audience and share some of the questions that we've been hearing from all of you with our panelists. And Neil, if I could start with you for our first question, that would be terrific. And then Carol and others, if you have thoughts to weigh in on that, would be really great as well. So we've been seeing a lot of questions from our audience come in that are really oriented around this connection between unique community needs and scalable evidence-based solutions, and how you manage the tension between those two. And I know, Neil, that this is something that you've clearly thought a lot about as you've been down this path with a few different evidence-based programs. And it would be terrific to hear from you and any of the other panelists with thoughts about just how can program models evolve to accommodate local realities without moving too far from the evidence base.
Yeah, Kelly, great. The key question, because it's a balance constantly. First and foremost, we found that you must have a program that has demonstrated ability to make change and a way to measure that change. And you cannot compromise on those elements that you are measuring to be sure that you're getting progress. So from our, use summer learning as, I think, a great example. First and foremost, we knew that we could move the needle 2.5 to 3 months. We knew what we had to measure. We knew what testing had to be done before and after the kids started. And we knew that certified teachers were key to success. Local communities made cases to us that they wanted to modify some curriculum to make it culturally appropriate in some areas. We were open to doing that with an understanding that we would not compromise on what we were measuring. Reading scores were reading scores, math scores were math scores. We did not at any point allow flexibility in using student teachers who were in college because we knew the results wouldn't be the same. So simply said, you have to know at the beginning what are those critical elements that the data shows you are necessary to get results, and you can't compromise on those. What surrounds that may open some possibilities for local community creativity, but if you allow full creativity, I know in our world, there's not a director in our YMCAs that doesn't think they have a better solution, and we would have ended up with 2,700 different approaches.
Yeah, this is Carol. I think I would echo that. It's very interesting to hear the very similar issues. And ours, because of the human services issue, we were able to pick up the self-sufficiency matrix that is used in a variety of funding packages. And there's actually then 15 life domains, so housing, employment, child care, legal issues, health issues. And there are 5 categories in each one. And so on that 75-box matrix, you have a chance to map out the consistency of process is the intake, the interview, the mapping of the process, and then the local adjustment is if you have to look at housing as a key element for getting out of poverty, getting out of your car, getting out of a shelter. Those things then become dependent on what are the resources in that community. That's the local approach, the collaborations you have, other partners, your creativity. But the end game is, are they in stable housing? And so that's very measurable, and we do the same thing that was just mentioned in terms of unique measures at the end, common measures for these unique family issues. But housing is housing, employment is employment, satisfactory child care, getting rid of all warrants or DUIs or anything that prohibits, getting a job. All of those things can be mapped and then tracked. But it's the bookend approach of a consistent process and consistent data gathering, and then you alternate the action steps in between based on the people.
And Carol, I would add to that, just in 30 seconds, there's 2 sides to this coin. All the local units always want to say, here's how you have to change the national program to accommodate my community.
Yeah.
Flip is true. Here's how your local community has to change if you, in fact, really want to get results.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Neil and Carol, so much for sharing your thoughts on that. And we've had quite a number of questions coming in from our audience about data sharing, and with each one of your stories, there was an important element of the role that data played in these transformation journeys. And so, how do you support data sharing at a network level? What are the best practices, and what resources were offered to affiliates to engage in those changes? And Steve, I know you in particular have a very interesting story about the way that you all thought about data, and I'm curious if you have thoughts to some of those questions about how you share data and what resources made that possible for your affiliates to engage in that.
Thank you. So the data sharing, we have a global metric system and a portal where people have for years put in information, but it became more complicated when we weren't the implementing agency. Someone else was doing the implementing. And so trying to understand what the impact was when we were actually training trainers in a sense in terms of market development and advocacy. In our theory of change conversation, we had somebody from the CDC join us who was in charge of their metrics department. And he said it's really important to distinguish between contribution and attribution. And when you're the direct service deliverer, it's easy to attribute the changes to your work. They're relatively easy. If you're delivering to a third party, it's harder to attribute because there's other things that impact the change, and you're really making a contribution. And what he said to us is really you just have to get attribution to the point where your theory of change can be verified by third-party research. So in terms, someone earlier talked about impact. So housing is an impact of health, education, wealth creation, community cohesion. We don't actually have to prove all those things, nor do we have to prove it for our partners. We just have to get to the point where we can demonstrate that there is improved housing, and there's third-party research that shows the linkage between improved housing and those other impacts. So if it's a partner organization, we do sampling exercises to sample to determine are those financial interventions or are those women's inheritance rights laws, are they actually changing and making a real difference in creating new housing interventions, quality housing standards. So those are a couple of things to think about, the attribution, contribution, and where does the role of research and sampling come into that.
And Steve, could I ask you to just spend another minute just sharing, because I think you have such an interesting example of some of the ways that you've actually looked at what some of your affiliates are doing differentially and how you share what's possible with other affiliates. So you have, I think, a really interesting way to motivate and inspire, but use best practices and benchmarks across your network very effectively.
So there is a fair amount of competition in the network. And so for each of the different kinds of objectives we have in the strategic plan, we have metrics, reports, and sharing that we actually show across the network who are the top 10 producers. We have a system where people can log in and get case studies. So what do they do to make a difference? We identified 10 countries to really drive change and be the champions for change. We created peer learning networks where we have peers globally who are in a similar context, similar size, institutional maturity, have peer-to-peer conversations to accelerate learning in those areas. So there's a number of ways that we do the network create sharing opportunities. I'm not sure that's what you had in mind, but those are some of the things we do to share that.
Yeah, that's terrific, Steve. Thank you. So we have an interesting question from our audience that I think gets really into the brass tacks of how do you make this happen. And the question is, how do you balance the pivot or the changes needed to make this transformation and at the same time keep up with business as usual? Did you hit the pause button on current activities, or how did you think about managing these two efforts? And let me just ask anyone on the panel who has thoughts on that could chime in. Thank you.
I can jump in again.
Go ahead.
All right. I can jump in while you're thinking. I would say for ours, it sounds like we had one of the most radical because we went from direct service delivery to really partnership delivery at a much larger scale.
Does someone else on the panel have a thought to share on that question?
This is Neil. For us, it was both and. We did not stop doing what we were previously doing, but we also provided some incentive grants to associations to get into this work. And when we found when you take on significant social and health issues, it opens up new opportunities at the local level for new funders to become involved with the organization, which always is attractive to our affiliates. So we had no intention of stopping many of the key things we were doing. It was how did we integrate these in a way that would allow our local associations to go forward.
We also, this is Carol. We also took a look at which of those current activities were actually things we could let go of. So that was one aspect of it, because sometimes people hold on to what they're doing and it actually may not be very effective any longer. So we tried to work with that in some of the time assessment and planning of the days. Then we also looked at what were different ways of handling things that were key activities. Could we handle them in a simpler way? Could we get other people participating in it? In other words, could we leverage where we were at instead of the same people adding more onto their plate? Could we bring other people in? Could we offload one of those activities to someone else, or could we just stop it? So it was kind of that keep, change, or stop approaches.
Sorry, this is Steve again. I lost my connection for a moment, if I could jump back in. There's a process that we use that comes out of a book called Nonprofit Sustainability. I highly recommend it if you're not familiar with that book. And in that book, there's a process that they use where they measure the level of impact on the y-axis and on the x-axis, whether you're subsidizing or profiting for cross-subsidization, the model, and then you separate into different program lines of business. And you have 4 or 5 program lines of business. You draw a circle with based on the amount, the expenses or the cost of that model, and then you have a rigorous leadership debate. Which one has the most impact, the least impact? Why? There's a really good section that leads you through 7 questions to kind of debate what impact looks like for you, what's important. And what they find is it creates a 4-box diagram, and in those 4 boxes, you have some in the top right corner that are highly profitable and high impact, and in the lower left-hand corner, low impact and low profitability. And it forces you as an organization to ask the question, are we keeping these subsidized programs with low impact? Is it a legacy issue? Does it leverage other programs that are high impact? It creates kind of a visual model that we used with our boards and key staff around the world. It was really helpful in trying to understand, of their different program lines of business, which ones have the most impact, which ones should they try to grow, and which ones does it make sense to sunset.
Kelly, could I just give 30 seconds of a funder's perspective?
Fantastic, Ron, please do.
Yeah, so probably the Y effort is a better example than 4-H in this regard. Neil was very smart at first to do a scan of STEM programs within the Ys, and we found that there was a lot of STEM programming throughout the Y system. However, some of it was episodic, some of it not very good quality. The ability to define what quality STEM programming looked like, what the dosage and duration was, to work with initially incentive grants to 10 Y systems who are pace setters within the national system to help them figure out how to offer quality and build staff capacity, and then to require a deeper level of third-party evaluation in those systems to determine what worked and what didn't. I think that really was fundamental in helping the Y system as it's been building its capacity for STEM across the system.
Thank you, Ron, for that perspective. And our final question of the day will be, it's related to how change management can be driven throughout the network depending on the level of funding from the central organization. So the question is, and Neil, would love to get your thoughts on this, is change management possible if the ratio of funding from headquarters is less than 50%? Or do you need to think about that funding in a different way in order to be able to really drive change management through a large network? And Neil, I know that you are representing the YUSA, but that you also clearly have experience with Y International. So if your answer could also apply to global networks, that would be terrific.
Sure. I don't believe you do have to provide 50% of the funding from the national organization. Funding that incents the behavior clearly is going to move things more quickly. But to me, more fundamental is having a coalition of like-minded people who are committed to the change, particularly on an international basis, where there are cultural differences, and money can't paper those differences over. People have to be in agreement on where they want to head and how they want to go about it. You can then go to work securing the funding, and as I alluded to earlier, assuring that what you're taking on opens up multiple funding channels. Ron and the Noyce Foundation, with our STEM work, provided national funding to help launch many of these programs, but that also opened up local possibilities because corporate interests, individual interests aligned with the importance of STEM education for kids. And so in many ways, the cultural alignment and commitment to change and the potential impact you can have, I find, comes first. And then, of course, money counts. I'm not naive about that. It has to be done, but not to move because you believe you have to find 50% of the money, to me, is simply never going to get you out of the starting gate. And I find this with our global work as well as our local work.
Terrific. Thank you, Neil. And thank all of you for joining us in this conversation today, and a special thanks to our panelists. You will receive an email with these slides and also a link to the Network Transformation article and other related Bridgespan resources. And this webinar will be available on the Bridgespan website in case you'd like to view that in the future. And if you all have an extra minute, it would be terrific if you could complete the survey that will pop up on your screen. We would love to have any feedback you have to help us improve future webinars. Thanks to everyone for joining us.